This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason. In this episode 887 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Almost exactly a year ago, I published an episode of the podcast called The Rise of the Early Round Quarterback. Years and years ago, when I first started in the fantasy football industry, quarterbacks were getting selected really early in drafts. But based on supply and demand and predictability, it didn't make much sense. A late round quarterback approach was much more approachable. So I wrote about it. I published the Late Round Quarterback ebook in 2012, and I've been brain vomiting fantasy takes ever since. We've been through a journey over the years. In that 2014 to 2015 timeframe, drafting a quarterback early was legitimately worthless. When looking at top 18 quarterbacks by ADP in 2015, for example, the correlation between where those quarterbacks were drafted and the number of fantasy points per game that they actually scored was zero. QB2s were getting you just as many points as QB1s. We were terrible at predicting performance. That all changed in 2020. And the reason it changed, in my eyes, is because of Lamar Jackson. Look, I've missed on a lot of things in fantasy football through the years. That's part of this gig. But the single take that I'm most proud of relates to this topic. After Jackson's monster MVP season in 2019, I wrote an article on whether or not he broke the late round quarterback strategy. Yes, he was a late round quarterback himself that year, but it was obvious that people were catching on. They were realizing the importance of mobility at the position in fantasy football. So I wrote about it. And at the end of that article, I wrote the following. You know, the truth is, the question about the late round quarterback strategy in fantasy football this year shouldn't really revolve around Lamar Jackson. It shouldn't be about whether or not you're willing to take Jackson in the top 25 or the top 30. Instead, our focus should be on the fact that the fantasy football world has gotten smarter. Historically, fantasy managers didn't put a premium on quarterback rushing production. They ignored what's been dubbed the Konami code of fantasy football. We don't see that anymore. The consensus top 7 quarterbacks this year are all players who bring that extra juice with their legs. So no, Lamar Jackson isn't what could break the idea of drafting quarterbacks late in fantasy football. You are. As the fantasy football world gets sharper, the late round quarterback strategy may slowly morph into the middle round quarterback strategy. Now, I bring this up every once in a while on the show because it's such a good example of why average draft position analysis is so important. You can be ahead of the game when you spot these macro trends. Not everything needs to be player analysis focused. We've definitely seen a change of the position since that time frame. When looking at the correlation between preseason expectation and postseason result over the last 4 seasons, it's night and day compared to what we saw in 2012, 2013, 2014. That's because the best quarterbacks in fantasy football are now running the ball and passing the ball well. You see, before, when friend of the show Rich Rebar wrote about the Konami code in fantasy football, the cheat code that is quarterback rushing, quarterbacks didn't have this unicorn ability of being great rushers and passers. We saw these one-off spike seasons, but in today's game, it's Lamar Jackson, it's Josh Allen, it's Jalen Hurts. These guys are posting good rushing numbers and good passing numbers. And when you get that combination, it becomes much easier to predict which quarterbacks are going to be good entering a given season. Now, I go through a lot of this in this year's late round draft guide. But something else that I talk about that's related to this is what I call the pocket passer trap. And that's what we're going to dig into today. Before going forward, I want to send another reminder about a very special offer. Right now, the late round draft guide is available for pre-order. It's the thing that I put the most work into each and every year. That guide is available right now over on lateround.com for $19.99. It's going to go up to $24.99 on July 1st when it launches. But you can get it for absolutely free. All you need to do is head to underdogfantasy.com or download the Underdog app. And if you're a new user, go sign up on Underdog, use promo code LATEROUND, and then make a deposit. That promo code will allow you to not only get a deposit offer, but you'll also get a free late round draft guide. The guide will be emailed to your inbox on July 1st when it launches. So again, UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. Sign up with promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit. You can do best ball drafts, all while getting a free late round draft guide. It doesn't get much better than that. So here's where we're at with the quarterback landscape. Elite quarterbacks have separated themselves not really from the standpoint that they're giving your fantasy teams a bigger points per game edge, but they're more predictable. The players who are giving you that edge, the ones separating themselves from the rest of the position, they're the guys who we're drafting early. Because rushing numbers are a lot more predictive than passing ones. And the market is putting the right premium on rushing quarterbacks. But not every early or middle round quarterback is mobile. Some of them are pocket passers. And that presents a problem that's not talked about nearly enough. When a more immobile quarterback has a big season, he's doing so because he has a big season through the air, right? And if he's scoring a lot of fantasy points, then he's likely throwing for a lot of touchdowns. On a weekly basis since 2011, the R squared between fantasy points per game and passing yards has been about 42%. That's 62% when looking at passing touchdowns to fantasy points scored. Meaning passing touchdowns correlate a lot stronger to fantasy output than yardage does on a weekly basis. Which makes sense because one passing touchdown equals 100 passing yards in most leagues. Touchdowns can be kind of random though. Like not totally random, but kind of random. If a team decides to run it at the goal line, then that quarterback won't benefit from that team's touchdown. But if they get stuffed and they run a play action pass in the very next play for a score, all of a sudden that quarterback has 4 fantasy points. That 1-yard touchdown is technically worth more than 100 yards passing because you're getting points for that 1 yard as well. That leads to variance with pocket passing quarterbacks. Touchdown rate is the easiest metric to go to with this kind of thing. Touchdown rate is just touchdowns divided by attempts. The league average since 2011 has been 4.4%. And since 2011, we've had 67 quarterback seasons where the quarterback had 20 or more fantasy points per game. Of those 67, 27 did it while failing to hit 50 rush attempts. So they were super immobile quarterbacks. They weren't running the ball that much. And of those 27, their average touchdown rates were 6.4%. That's 2 percentage points higher than the league average. Getting to that number is not easy. Being in the 6.4% touchdown rate range, that's no easy task. In fact, only 7 quarterbacks over the last 13 years have gotten to that touchdown rate more than once in a season with 300 or more pass attempts. Those quarterbacks are basically all Hall of Fame quarterbacks. So what does that alone tell us? Well, it tells us that if you're going to draft a pocket passer with a higher end pick in fantasy, you're going to need variance on your side at least a little bit. You'll at least need it on your side a lot more than you would with a mobile quarterback, because those mobile quarterbacks are scoring points with their legs too. Let me break this down even further. I looked at ADP data via fantasydata.com since 2014. I then split quarterbacks into buckets. You've got the QB1 to the QB3 by ADP, the QB4 to the QB6, and so on. And I only included quarterbacks who then went on to play 8 or more games in the season. I then took those quarterback groupings and I wanted to see how well they scored in points per game. So the QB1 to the QB3 bucket, we've had 27 of them since 2014 play 8 or more games in the season. And of those 27, over 96% of them, so 26 of the 27, scored 16 or more points per game. This is standard points, so 4 points per touchdown pass, 1 point per 25 yards. 70% of them scored 18 or more points. 52% of them scored 20 or more points. You get the idea. When you chart this out with all quarterbacks, and that table will be in the late round draft guide, when you lay it all out, clear tiers start to form. The QB1 to the QB6, they've got great hit rates, at least since 2014. That's not that big of a surprise though, because we've become so much better at projecting quarterback output in recent years. The QB7 to the QB9 range, honestly, it's not been that much different than the QB13 to the QB15 range. So if you're looking to take a quarterback in that range, that QB7 to QB9 range, you might want to consider just waiting a little bit more to extract value. More on that in a second though. And then after QB15, it's kind of an S show. There really aren't many season-long hits, and season-long is the key word here. I'm looking across the entire season. But there aren't that many hits from quarterbacks that go that late. You'll get the CJ Strouds and the Brock Purdy's and the Jordan Loves. But even those guys weren't scoring 20 or more points per game. They weren't massive league winners. Now, this data is looking at all quarterbacks since 2014 who were drafted in these different positional buckets. What's really interesting is what happens when you separate these players into mobile and immobile quarterbacks. Because if we know that quarterback mobility is important, and we know that's a huge driver for quarterback predictability, then it would make sense that these mobile quarterbacks are the reason that the QB1 to the QB6 range by ADP has been so successful through the years. And that's generally the case. I took that table and I split it up a little bit differently. I took all the QB1 to QB6s by ADP and I threw them together. Then I took all the QB7 to QB15s and I threw them together. Remember, that QB7 to QB9 range, not any different results-wise through the years than the QB13 to the QB15 range. So having them all together in a group made sense. So we have two groups here. One has all quarterbacks drafted between QB1 and QB6 by ADP. The other, QB7 to QB15. We'll call these groups the elite quarterbacks and then the good quarterbacks. That'll keep things easier to follow. I then took those two groupings and I split them up one more time. I split them up by players who ran the ball 4 or more times per game and players who didn't run the ball 4 or more times per game. And that's where the data really started to come together. First off, top 6 quarterbacks who run the ball at least a moderate amount have been really easy bets in fantasy football. Now, obviously, there's an opportunity cost involved in drafting those players. It's not a necessity to get one of them. But 40% of them in the elite range have ended up scoring 22 or more points per game. 56% of them have hit 21 points per game. And there's 25 quarterbacks in our sample here. Now, of course, that group includes Josh Allen basically each year. But that's also the point. These guys are so consistently good for your rosters. It's not what we had in 2013 and 2014, where there would be this turnover every single season. Now, since 2014, this elite group had 32 quarterbacks get drafted who were under 4 rush attempts per game. They were more of the pocket passer types. Of those players, 6.3% scored 22 or more points per game. Fewer than 19% hit 21 points per game. That's a massive difference compared to the elite mobile quarterbacks. And when you compare those numbers to the good quarterback group, the guys who get drafted much later, it's pretty interesting. The elite pocket passers had a pretty good hit rate of getting to 20 or more points per game. It was 40.6%. But then that dropped to 18.8% at 21 points per game. That's what I just referenced. So they weren't bad at getting to 20 points per game, but they were pretty brutal at getting to 21 or 22 points per game. 20 points per game is still really good. You'll probably find a quarterback in the top 5 of the position with that kind of score. But 21, 22, that's an elite season. That's what we're really striving for. The good pocket passers hit 20 or more points at a 15% rate. That's significantly lower than the elite counterparts. They were at 40%. But their rate of getting to 21 points per game was only 7 percentage points lower. And they've actually been a little bit better at getting to 22 points per game. To put this all another way, because I know it's probably hard to follow, top 6 quarterbacks by ADP who are pocket passers, they're better than the pocket passers that you can get late. But if you're looking at a true ceiling, the league winning ceiling, there's really not that big of a difference. Now, this led me to thinking more about game theory too. When we're talking QB1 to QB6, our elite quarterback group, those guys are going to be drafted by like round 5, even earlier in more casual leagues. The QB13, QB14, they're going to go in the double-digit rounds. I remember doing one of the first episodes of Late Round Perspectives last year and talking to Sean Siegel about this. But I think going with a 2-headed quarterback approach does make sense in scenarios like this, and math backs it up. Say you're in a draft and you decide to get a pocket passer who's getting drafted early. History tells us that you have a 40% chance that he scores 20 or more points per game, which is solid. His rate of getting to 21, 22 points per game isn't as good, but 40% is solid. But let's say that you didn't want to take on that opportunity cost and you waited instead. Rather than getting one pocket passing quarterback in that high-end QB2 range, what if you got two? You're giving yourself better odds of getting a quarterback who could score 20 or more points per game. In fact, and this is just based on what we've seen historically, obviously we need to be a little bit looser with our parameters and how we think about all of this. It's just the idea here that matters. But like I said, elite pocket passers by ADP, they score 20 or more points per game at a 40% rate. In the QB 13 to QB 15 range, if you were to draft two of them, based on what we've seen since 2014, you'd have a 32% chance to get to 20 or more points per game. That's not that far off from these early round pocket passers. And from a cost perspective, using two double-digit round picks versus one fourth or fifth rounder might be more appealing for your particular league. Meanwhile, when you draft two of these high-end QB2 pocket passers, your rate of getting to 21, 22 points per game, it's significantly higher than an early round pocket passer. You're increasing your odds dramatically of having a player who could be a league-winning quarterback, who could have an outlier season in touchdown rate. And this is all because touchdowns bring a lot of variance. Those early round quarterbacks are better quarterbacks, and better quarterbacks will have better touchdown rates, generally speaking. But that doesn't mean that there's zero variance here. There's a ton of variance. Now, don't get me wrong. This is just one approach. This is one strategy. It shouldn't be the strategy. To me, the strategy is to find a mobile quarterback anywhere throughout your draft. If you look at the mobile quarterbacks who have been drafted in that QB7 to QB15 range through the years, they've outplayed the pocket passers who have been drafted in the QB1 to QB6 range. In other words, a late round mobile quarterback is better than an early round pocket passing quarterback. Now, obviously, we have the benefit of hindsight here. We're grouping players by whether or not they ran the ball 4 or more times in a season. But rushing is more predictive at quarterback than passing is. If you look at the current quarterback landscape, you can pinpoint which ones are rushers and which ones aren't. Josh Allen, rusher. Jalen Hurts, rusher. Lamar Jackson, rusher. CJ Stroud, not a rusher. Dak Prescott, not a rusher. Jordan Love, not a rusher. And you can use that to your advantage. It's not that a player like CJ Stroud or Dak Prescott or Jordan Love are worse than a pocket passer that you draft later, like Tua or Brock Purdy. It's that there's a cost to acquire those players that's much greater. And if you're in a league environment with deeper benches, or you're in a league where you really don't want to take on that cost of a higher end quarterback, then you can go with that two-headed monster, as long as you're still focused on getting a mobile quarterback. Because at the end of the day, throughout your draft, those mobile quarterbacks are still winning championships. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Got a Becoming a Best Ball Bro episode dropping tomorrow, and then it's a mailbag week, so I'll talk to you on Friday with that one. Take care.